Good afternoon. My name is John Chipman, and I'm the Director General and Chief Executive of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, headquartered in London. And it's a delight for me to be here in this bicentennial year of Singapore. This is the 35th Fullerton Lecture, and it's the very first one that I've had the privilege and honor to chair. The previous 34 Fullerton Lectures have been chaired by the Executive Director of the IISS Asia, Tim Huxley, and his able staff. And so the first thing I want to do this afternoon is to thank IISS Asia for having built the Fullerton Lecture series into the best lecture series of its kind in the Indo-Pacific region, and take also this opportunity to thank the Fullerton Hotel, Robert Ung, Cavalieri Giovanni Vitarelli for their tremendous support of this IISS lecture series. And it's a delight for me today to welcome as our 35th Fullerton lecturer, Jeremy Fleming, the director of Gchq in the United Kingdom. He's been director of our Signals Intelligence Agency since April 2016. Gchq is properly styled as a world-leading intelligence, security, and cyber agency with a mission to keep the United Kingdom safe. Mr. Fleming joined government service from the private sector in 1993. He was a career MI5 officer with significant professional experience of national security and intelligence work, including international and Northern Ireland counterterrorism, counterespionage, cyber, and protective security. And today, in his Fullerton Lecture, he will explore the concept and reality of cyber power and examine what he sees as the main components of cyber power. And following his on-the-record remarks, he and I will have a brief on-the-record conversation afterwards. But with that, may I welcome Jeremy Fleming to deliver the 35th Fullerton Lecture. Thank you.
I won't shake your hand, I've just cut it. Yeah. So thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's great to be here. And firstly, I'd like to thank the International Institute for Strategic Studies for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak about cyber power. It's a topic I know needs wider discussion. And it's great to see IISS once again breaking new ground. So thank you, John. In particular, I'd like to thank the wider IISS team for the wonderful work they do with this speaker series. They always pull together a strong and influential audience. And it's clear to me they're doing great work promoting geopolitical debate here in the Southeast Asian region. I'd also like to thank the team here at the Fullerton Hotel for all they've done to ensure we have such a productive conference. So it's always great to be here in Singapore. I enjoy visiting the amazingly vibrant and successful city, its palpable optimism for the future, and the impact it has far beyond its shores. I love the way it blends the old and the new. I don't think any of us can miss the juxtaposition between the state-of-the-art GPO of the 19th century we're in today and the subject matter we're here to discuss. I echo what Jeremy Hunt, our Foreign Secretary, said in January about the similarities between our two countries. We're joined at the hip not just by common interests and our shared dedication to the rule of law, but by our shared history that's connected our two peoples together for 200 years. And it's that sense of shared history and common endeavour that's just as relevant for the other nations present here today. Indeed, I would argue that as we enter the fourth industrial revolution, as we think about how we'll continue to prosper as nations whilst protecting the rights and lives of our citizens, it's never been more important. Which brings me to the point of this speech and of this event. And that's the concept of cyber power. What does it mean? What does a country need to have at its disposal to be a cyber power? How should it exercise that power? What rules, regulations, and ethics are needed to exercise that power responsibly? Now, we're all contending with these questions. Our nations are breaking new ground as we develop cyber capabilities, grapple with cybersecurity, and start to think about the skills and the rules we need for the cyber age. So how can we move forward together? Look, my proposition is that we need to converge on agreed definitions, on regulatory frameworks, industry standards, and norms of ethical behaviours. Frankly, we need a new lexicon, one that isn't based on the overly military language of past power frameworks, but a language that clearly refreshes and restates for the cyber age the underlying principles that have served our democracies so well for hundreds of years. We have a way to go. Take the language we use to describe cybersecurity or cyber activities: malware, ransomware, botnet, distributed denial of service, to name some of the more incomprehensible terms in use. Then look at the questions we ask about how we measure up to those who would do us harm. How big is their force? How much do they spend? How many hackers do they have? And this sort of framing has been around for decades. It worked for an environment where power was seen partly or wholly through a military lens, an environment where numbers or scale were what mattered. But in the cyber world, the size of force doesn't equal potency. Deterrence isn't absolute. And cyber attacks are often disruptive or financially motivated rather than destructive. It's a cyber world that's changing at an incredible rate, making the world more interconnected than ever before. It's driving extraordinary opportunity, innovation, and progress. But it's also unleashing unprecedented complexity, uncertainty, instability, and risk. Now, I suspect that many of my predecessors as director of GCHQ will have said or felt something similar. We've contended with changing technologies throughout our 100-year history. But there's definitely something unique about the combination of uncertain doctrine, hyper-technology change, and a new form of ungoverned security space that's making this peculiarly challenging. And it's this uniqueness that makes it difficult to keep up, or crucially to explain these changes to our citizens. So I believe we need a better framework for this conversation, one that provides reference points for the debate about cyber power, and one that recognises that the concept goes way beyond technology and way beyond the internet. Now, I've given this much thought. The UK, indeed all of us, need to better understand the challenges and opportunities we face and how best to shape the debate with our partners, allies, and even our adversaries around the world. In short, we need to pioneer a new form of security for the cyber age. Now, I think we can all recognise the basic definitions of power. It's the ability to direct or influence the behaviour of others. And power comes in many hues. Soft power, exercised by those who may set an example, project thought leadership, encourage adherence to a particular set of legal or ethical boundaries. Whilst hard power comes from economic, military, or technology might. And taking this over into the cyber domain is not straightforward, but there are clear parallels. And I think we can do better at setting out some core principles. To me, a nation is a cyber power if it's able to direct or influence the behaviour of others in cyberspace. And it can do this in three main ways. So one, it has to be world-class in safeguarding the cyber health of its citizens, businesses, and institutions. It must protect the digital homeland. Two, it has to have the legal, ethical, and regulatory regimes to foster public trust. Without that, we don't have a license to operate in cyberspace. And three, when the security of its citizens are threatened, it has to have the ability, in extremis and in accordance with international law, to project cyber power to disrupt, deny, or degrade. So I'd like to explore each of these elements in turn. starting with cybersecurity. Now, those of us who work in government, and especially those who've worked in national security roles, know that the first responsibility of any government is to protect its citizens. In the 21st century, this relates to the digital homeland as well as the physical one. And to enable this protection, we have to put in place measures designed to make individuals and institutions harder to attack. So we focused on responding to cyber incidents to reduce harm and increase confidence, and we developed new partnerships with industry and academia to share knowledge, remove basic threats, and influence behaviour. We've also grown our key partnerships at home, across the Five Eyes, in Europe, and of course here in Southeast Asia. And in the UK, this sense of a team cyber is spreading way beyond the normal national security community, with GCHQ's National Cyber Security Centre leading our response. Law enforcement colleagues are lining up with intelligence partners, industry and academia. We're reaching down into schools, hiring communication specialists to get the messages to stick, and working with venture capitalists and startups to foster technologies for the next generation. We've also worked hard to take a genuinely strategic approach. It's easy to get stuck in the maelstrom of today's attacks. But I think we need to get better at designing in cybersecurity from the start. In particular, we're trying to make the internet automatically safer for people to use, so they don't have to make daily judgments on whether every email or website they come into contact with can be trusted. This is especially important given the way that criminals are increasingly operating, sometimes with the support, active or passive, of malign states. Now, this complex environment was a big driver behind the National Cybersecurity Centre's active or automated cyber defence programme. And this aims to protect most of the citizens from most of the harm for most of the time. We've already set out some impressive early results of this work. Protecting 1.3 million government internet users, automatically blocking access to bad sites we know about. And this stopped 54 million malicious connections last year alone. We have an anti-spoofing mechanism which greatly reduced the spoofing of UK government brands. Our automated takedown service, run by a private company, has more than halved the UK's share of global phishing. This is really exciting innovation. It helps make the UK a harder target. It takes away some of the impossible decisions we ask our citizens to make that affect our security. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that we're impregnable. It just means we're harder to attack. But there is so much more to do to fix an internet that was not designed with security in mind. With big structural security problems like identity spoofing and malicious hosting still to be tackled. Now, my job as director of GCHQ in this space is twofold. First, it's to help get these innovations implemented at a scale that makes a truly nationally and potentially internationally transformative difference. We have a set of service that we've tried out on our own government, on our own terms. But what happens when the big communication service providers start to introduce R-blocking techniques at scale? What happens when retailers take up some of the security indicators we've been developing and use them to promote safety and security? When large corporates really get on board with anti-spoofing? What we hope is that we start to build a truly whole-of-nation, world-class cyber defence system, and one that works at a citizen level. Now, my second job is to create the time and space for the elite cyber talent we have working on this area to develop the next set of transformative ideas. Things like, how do we authenticate emails in a way that people might actually be able to understand? How do we break free of the limitations of password-based user security? How do we make hardware harder to interfere with? How do we allow networks to connect freely, but in a way that an infection of one is not an infection of all? Now, in GCHQ, I'm fond of saying that with the right mix of minds, anything is possible. And we have some ingenious people working on these challenges. I know they're equal to the task. They will find new ways of dealing with the emergence of new technology. But they're doing this work in a pretty charged environment. And I, need to find them the space to get on with real, practical solutions. Now, obviously, the most charged part of the current global technology debate relates to 5G, and in particular, the role of Huawei. Now, before going further, let's remember 5G is going to be one of the most important and impactful technologies of this or any era. It'll massively enhance how we use the internet. It'll be a catalyst for technology change. And over time, it'll change the way we think about how our data is being used. But it'll also make us more interwoven and dependent on the internet. It's not entirely a cliff-edge transition, and it won't entirely change the way we think about security. So navigating this exciting, transformative technology is going to be difficult, and it will be different in each country. So let me talk about the UK's approach. 5G is complicated, and understanding the complexity and nuance is essential. The NCSE, as part of Gchq, is the National Technical Authority for Cybersecurity. It's our job to bring objective, evidence-based, and technically authoritative advice to the policy table. Now, last week, the NCSE set out how we're approaching these issues. And the most important aspect of that intervention was in defining 3 preconditions for securing 5G networks. First, we must have stronger cybersecurity practices across the telecommunications sector. The market is configured in a way that does not incentivize good cybersecurity, and that has to change. Second, telecoms networks must be more resilient. Vulnerabilities can and will be exploited, but networks should be designed in a way that cauterizes the damage. So we must do that. And third, there must be sustainable diversity in the supplier market. A market consolidated to such an extent that there are only a tiny number of viable options will not make for good cybersecurity. And that's regardless of whether those options are Western, Chinese, or from somewhere else. Now, experience shows us that any company in an excessively dominant market position will not be incentivized to take cybersecurity seriously. So we need a diversified market that's competing on quality and security, as well as price. These 3 conditions are objective, they're technical, and they're evidence-based. And I'm determined that they're not lost in the speculation of recent months. So as we made clear last week, the UK has not made a decision on 5G. There is an ongoing review led by the Digital Department and its Secretary of State, which will conclude its analysis in the spring. And only when that's complete will the government make a decision about the supply chain balance. And Gchq is at the heart of that work. We already have a role managing Huawei's presence in our existing networks, and we think that this is probably the toughest oversight regime for that company in the world. It's revealed significant problems with their cybersecurity practices, which have caused them to commit to a multi-million-pound remedial program. And as I'm sure you've seen, we've been crystal clear that we will not compromise on the improvements that we expect. But, and it's an important but, 5G security is about more than just Huawei. And that's what the 3 preconditions for 5G security are all about. The final thing I'd say here is that the strategic challenge of China's place in an era of globalized technology is much bigger than just one telecommunications equipment company. It's a first-order strategic challenge for us all. Part of being a cyber power is facing up to that challenge and those posed by technology more broadly. We have to understand the opportunities and the threats from China's technology offer. We have to understand the global nature of supply chain and service provision, irrespective of the flag of the supplier. We have to take a clear view on the implications of China's technological acquisition strategy in the West. And we have to help our governments decide which parts of this expansion can be embraced, which need risk management, and which will always need a sovereign or an allied solution. It's a hugely complex strategic challenge, which will span the next few decades, probably my whole professional career. How we deal with it will be crucial for prosperity and security way beyond 5G contracts. And to my mind, it shows just how significant cybersecurity is becoming to a nation's cyber power. Now, my second basic tenet of cyber power governs the way in which a nation behaves and the frameworks within which it operates. We know that statutory and regulatory regimes around cyberspace are not yet mature. Case law is still developing in all of our jurisdictions, and some of the behaviour we've seen from certain states or criminals is clearly wrong in any circumstance. An attack on a hospital's IT or on a country's electoral system will always require sanction. But in many cases, there are no clear norms or behaviours, and in some cases, there's a clear divergence in view between blocks of nations about how to develop these norms for the future. And there's a lot at stake here. Without a commonly agreed set of principles, it's much harder to reach agreement on common standards, to exchange trust and data, to prosecute poor behaviours, and to create a commonly agreed doctrine of deterrence. And the situation is diverging, not converging, as the internet fragments and half of the world not yet on the internet gains access to mobile computing. So unchecked, we're heading for an even less governed space, where rights and wrongs are not automatically recognised, and where acceptable behaviours are not a given. We're certainly heading for a situation where it's harder for states to underpin or guarantee the trust their citizens expect in their dealings online. So in my view, dealing with this uncertainty means building on the approaches we've developed over centuries in international law. Put simply, if something is unacceptable in the real world, it must be unacceptable online. But as cyber capability becomes more advanced and more widely used, we have to ensure that domestic and international law keeps pace. Last year, the UK's Attorney General said the following, and I quote, "It is the UK's view that there are boundaries of acceptable state behaviour in cyberspace, just as there are everywhere else." He stressed the need for the application and interpretation of international law to keep pace with change in the real and digital worlds. I'd build on that by saying it's perfectly possible for individuals and states to act responsibly in cyberspace in support of and not against the rules-based international order. We need to work towards common understandings of how to apply, interpret, and develop this law. The international conversation on these issues remains at an early stage, but we're beginning to see a degree of progress. So if we can all accept that international law applies to the cyber realm, the question for us to answer now is how it applies. And like other global laws and rules, it'll take a time to settle. We need to up the pace to ensure its legitimacy and to support its support. It's my belief that discussions of these rules and standards should not solely be driven or facilitated by the national security community. There are many other equities involved than security. We need a full debate across government and working with the leaders of the tech industry, academics, and civil society. There will, of course, be those who do not want to adhere to these common standards, those who are intent on causing disruption and harm. To illustrate, about a half of the 1,100 incidents handled by the NCSC in the last 2 years have a state actor behind them. The UK and our allies have called out this activity and attributed these attacks. And the UK government's ministers have remained very clear that we will keep on doing this. Again, it was the Attorney General who said, "It is the UK's views that when states and individuals engage in hostile cyber operations, they are governed by law, just like activities in any other domain." When we see cyber attacks by states, terrorists, or criminals, our first priority is to seek to use the criminal justice system to achieve a prosecution. And if this is not possible, we will aim to impose a cost to this behaviour, including through public attribution of the perpetrators. For example, in 2018, we attributed disruptive cyber activity to a Chinese group known as APT-10, or Stone Panda. And a few months before that, we exposed a GRU campaign conducted by a Russian group, APT-28, or Fancy Bear, which indiscriminately used cyber attacks to target political institutions, businesses, media, and sport. This type of behaviour must stop, and as China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea all saw last year, the UK and its allies will keep calling this out. To limit the effect of this unacceptable behaviour, we will continue to give businesses the information they need to defend themselves. We're making citizens cyber literate, the first line of defence. We're ensuring they understand what they can do to keep themselves and the wider country safe online. And the deterrence we're aiming for goes beyond cybersecurity products and systems. It's a mindset, a coalition of citizens and businesses informed by practical and easy to digest advice. We're confident that done in the right way, it can make a real difference. And that right way requires individuals and states to act responsibly in cyberspace in support of, not against, the rules-based international order. Now, I think ethics are central to that. I've always liked the philosopher and scientist Aldo Leopold's definition of ethics, and he said it was about doing the right thing even when no one else is watching. And nowhere does that apply so much than in the world of national security. In spying, intelligence gathering, espionage, whatever term you'd like to use, I believe that there are ethical rules and boundaries, and these should be followed and upheld. Now, of course, the UK is a liberal democracy. There's extensive oversight of the work of the intelligence and the security agencies. Someone else, typically a senior judge, is always watching over what we do. Perhaps it's easy to be ethical in such a situation. And in our democracy, sometimes we take that oversight for granted. Nonetheless, our analysts are constantly reminded that it's not enough to be able to do something. It's not even enough for it to be legal to do something. It must also be right to do something. And internationally, amidst the confusion of malevolent states, serious crime groups, hacktivists, terror groups, and their hostile online activities, it could be tempting to put ethics aside, or to assume a moral equivalency between actors. But I don't believe we live in a Hobbesian world where might equals right and where integrity is a sign of weakness. And looking around this room, I see friends and allies committed to the international rule of law in cyberspace, committed to discussion, to listening to alternative views, to acting with restraint. In short, organisations and nations that are committed to acting ethically, even when our adversaries refuse to do so. The greater the capabilities and norms we develop together, the more important this dimension of cyber power becomes. It's at the heart of our shared values and our collective strength. It gives us our license to operate, and I hope it also enables us to retain the trust of the societies we serve. So to bring this section to a point, the digital age still requires us to be governed by the rule of law. It still requires us to have the highest levels of ethics, but it requires those immutable concepts and our values to operate in new and difficult terrain. Ultimately, it's a framework that promotes the responsible use of cyber power. Of course, that responsibility applies as much to the projection of a nation's cyber capabilities as it does to cyber defence. The ability in extremis to be able to use cyber tools to disrupt, deny, or degrade is the most contentious and least well understood aspect of cyber power. It's also another part of GCHQ's role alongside our military and intelligence partners. Some call it offensive cyber, others effects or covert cyber operations. Ultimately, regardless of the label, it's about taking action online that has a direct real-world effect. Many nations are building these capabilities and are obviously seeing real value in deploying them. But some are deploying them in ways that do not accord with the basic tests I've just raised, with a reckless approach to broader damage and with little regard to the criminality of the effects they're trying to achieve. North Korea's use of ransomware to prop up the finances of that regime is a good example here. But in the right context, governed by appropriate international and domestic laws, offensive cyber is an essential part of a nation's cyber toolkit. Here's an example. For well over a decade, starting in the conflict in Afghanistan, GCHQ has pioneered the development and use of these cyber techniques. In recent years, we've worked ever more closely with the Ministry of Defence and key allies to grow these capabilities at pace. And last year I spoke about GCHQ's cyber operations for the first time and the damage it did to Daesh. This was the first time the UK had systematically and persistently degraded an adversary's online efforts as part of a wider military campaign. We can see that these operations made a significant contribution to coalition efforts to suppress Daesh propaganda, hindered their ability to coordinate attacks, and protected coalition forces on the battlefield. And this was remarkable work carried out by a talented and committed group of men and women from several nations, and it helped lead to the end of the physical caliphate. It's not the only example where action online to cause real-world effect is enhancing regional and global security. Its use gives nations or institutions like NATO, where the UK's cyber capabilities are an increasingly important contribution to the alliance, the ability to surgically disrupt, deny, or degrade an adversary's network where it's being used to cause harm. And in that way, it's unlike any other lever available to government. I'd like to add another point of emphasis here. These types of capabilities are not kept in a locker solely to respond to cyber or digital aggression. Cyber action cannot equal cyber reaction. The UK's response to a cyber action by an adversary or a criminal is determined by ministers, and they consider the full range of possible options. And that broader approach is integral to what we call our fusion doctrine. Others call this a hybrid approach. The words are different, but the effect is the same. Any use must be considered alongside diplomatic, economic, political, and hard power levers. And it's here that my point about ethics, frameworks, and responsible usage must be repeated. Yes, these offensive capabilities give a nation incredible reach and impact, but we must not see them as the answer to every problem. Their use must always meet the three tests of legality, necessity, and proportionality. Their use, in particular, to cause disruption or damage, must be in extremis. So if we accept that cyber power has at least these three components, I'd also argue that it's increasingly the case that our nations cannot operate in isolation. Our future security will be guaranteed not by the quality of our coding, the design of our silicon, or the cunning of our cyber operators, by the bonds that tie us together and the relationships that give us confidence to act decisively against common threats. I've already touched upon the challenges of interconnectivity in the online world. The technology that crosses national boundaries, the data flows that wash around our economies every minute of every day. All of our governments are under huge pressure to harness this technology for good and to provide solutions for the accompanying social harms. But the geography of cyberspace does not equate to the borders laid down in the industrial age. No nation, no company, no one group can deliver success alone. We need to reinvigorate and adapt old partnerships and build and shape new ones. These alliances between countries, with the private sector, with academia, are only limited by our imagination and willingness to embrace change. Countries such as the UK will always provide the leadership to contain, frustrate, and defeat our adversaries in cyberspace. But we're infinitely stronger when we act in concert with our allies, whether that's the Five Eyes, with NATO, or with other partners around the world. We should come together as a community to drive standards, harness skills and capabilities, share knowledge, and defend ourselves against our adversaries. A word of caution, however, creating and evolving these alliances still requires work. We need collectively to invest in cyber capabilities, offense and defense, whether that be cybersecurity, governance, or the ability to project cyber power. Many of us will bring all of these capabilities to the table, others only some, but each of our commitments must be real and meaningful. So this has to be an era of new alliances, and not just those between traditional partners, because the internet is not governed by states alone. We must be bold, put aside historic differences where we can, and bring together the best people from academia, government, civil society, industry, and even standards bodies to think through these challenges. In short, we all need to engage differently to make the most of this, starting with the 5G challenge that we've already covered. We must find new ways to encourage that type of openness and collaboration that we know works between peoples and nations. And finally, alliances require us to act, and decisively if needs be. Processes and debate should not become an excuse for prevarication and delay. Instead, we should show collectively the courage of our convictions in cyberspace, as we would elsewhere. We must use our combined cyber activities and capabilities to frustrate and defeat our adversaries. There may sometimes be tensions, as in any partnership. But I recall the words of Sir Winston Churchill. There is at least one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that is fighting without them. So to conclude, cyber power is about defending our digital homeland. It's about having the right capabilities to actively promote and protect our interests if we need to. It's about having stronger alliances, growing connections, boosting collaboration, finding ways to encourage openness and collaboration between people and nations. It's about creating new rules of engagement for our digital future so we can share ideas and work together for stability and prosperity. But cyber power is also about having the right technical expertise to use cyber power well and having the right legal and ethical base to use it wisely. It's about embracing the unexpected and seeing into the future. Now, I believe the UK is a cyber power with the potential to provide leadership in this debate. I think GCHQ is at the heart of that. And I'm confident we can succeed because with the right mix of minds, anything is possible. Thank you.
Jeremy Fleming, thank you very much. And I think everybody in this audience and those watching the webcast now or a little bit later will have been extremely impressed by your central message that the exercise of cyber power has to be married to a commitment to ethical approach and organized within a legal framework if that political license to operate is to be sustained. I have 4 or 5 questions, I think, inspired by what you said in your prepared remarks. The first is about the new kind of cybersecurity. You talked a lot about the need for technology to be secure by design, about the need to foster technologies for the next generation. Tell us a little bit more about how GCHQ and the United Kingdom's authorities work with the private sector to ensure that the future of our cyber world is as hygienic as it can be.
Thank you, John. I touched on some of these during those remarks, but my central proposition here is that we need to pioneer a new form of security for the new environment we face. And that's not a proposition that everything we've done so far isn't fit for purpose or doesn't work or relationships aren't still effective. Clearly that is not the case. The alliances we've built, the capabilities we have, the trust that we have generated both with our citizens and more broadly remain relevant here. So there's lots to build on. But what I am saying is that in this world we need to have a new form of security that is both more transparent and open. So one of the features of the work that my agency has been involved in recent years is the extent to which things go from the deeply secret to the very open very quickly. The way in which we need to break out intelligence to inform advice and how citizens operate. The second area is the partnerships that we need, way beyond states. So in our work on cyber security, we have an aspiration to have 100 of the UK's top companies inside the cybersecurity unit, bringing with them their understanding and knowledge and networks, taking part in how government shapes policy for the next generation, getting early insight and the ability to access data. In the work we're doing with academia, encouraging new skills, the adoption of new curriculum, reaching down as early as 15, 16 in schools to try and encourage girls in particular to take up STEM subjects. These are all new and different ways of security agencies playing in the national security framework, and I think it's to be welcomed. And the interesting thing for me, and I will conclude at that point, is the way in which those approaches in the cybersecurity world have an impact on the rest of the national security world too. The next generation of national security capabilities are built much more collaboratively than the last, and that's a direct result of that.
In your remarks, you briefly mentioned the challenge of deterrence, that deterrence cannot really be absolute in the cyber domain. Say a little bit more about what deterrence means in the cyber world.
So I think when any of us say deterrence, then we automatically think about deterrence of the Cold War years, don't we? We think about a deterrence built on nuclear doctrine, and clearly the comparisons are completely inappropriate for the cyber world. That's because of the range of impacts that can happen in cyberspace. It's because of the availability of the capabilities to a broad range of state and non-state actors, and it's because the difficulties in attribution. So the two frameworks, even the word itself, is really hard to compare, old deterrence to new deterrence. But that said, if we take the word at its very basic level, then we need to be operating in such a way that states and individuals and criminals understand that there are lines beyond which they tread where there will be some reaction. So this is about the creation of those statutory, legal, ethical norms that I was referring to in my speech here, and understanding that if you meddle in an electoral process, or if you get, the example I was used, into a nation's health system, then that is a step too far. The trouble we have is that case law around this is still new and developing. We have maybe a decade, maybe 15 years, if you stretch it a lot, of examples of where cyber action has been taken. And frankly, that's not enough. So the work that you and the Institute, people in academia are doing to help us think about this concept, I think is really important work.
I remember having a conversation once with the director of MI5, Andrew Parker, and we were talking about governed and ungoverned spaces, and he said, there's really no such thing as ungoverned spaces. They're just governed by people we don't particularly like. So can you say a little bit about what it means, ungoverned spaces in the cyber realm, and whether we are actually in prospect of getting to that nirvana of more international norms and standards in the cyber realm?
Well, of course, I spent much of my career working for Andrew, so I'm not going to go against his word there. I mean, I think the point is, if they're governed or not, they might be governed in a very different way and with a very different framework that we might think is acceptable. And when I talk about ungoverned spaces in cyberspace, then I'm recognizing the reality that the national and international boundaries that we have all grown up in, that we've developed our national security doctrine in, just don't apply in the same way in cyberspace. The way in which all of our communications are routed every day, the way in which our technology upon which we depend and our businesses depend operate beyond our borders, just give us very few frames of reference. And whilst it is the case that the internet has always been governed to a degree, it's not governed in the same way as physical spaces are. And I think all of us and all of our democracies are stepping towards a point where it probably is a bit more regulation required. And certainly we're stepping to a space where we need to have a broader understanding of where international norms are. So like you, I'm pretty pessimistic, John. I think that there will be if you like, an all of United Nations agreement to a cyber compact. I can't see that happening anytime soon. But I can see like-minded nations operating together to create frameworks within which the concept of what is governed and ungoverned becomes more clear to us. And the point of the remarks here is that I think it's probably time for us to increase the pace of that work.
So just moving from that, increasing the pace of that, what do we need to do to develop, at least amongst like-minded states, some sort of collective security in the cyber realm then? Or a collective security approach? Is that the right way of thinking about it for cyber?
Well, I think there's an aspect of that, but I think as we've said already, this goes way beyond security as an issue. So we have to think, and it's the way I think of technology as being fundamental drivers for our prosperity as nations. And security is one of the ways we try and safeguard that. So thinking about this as purely a defensive thing, I'm not sure is entirely helpful. We have to think about it as a whole of government thing where we are looking to not only project those norms, not only develop where needed statute or regulation, but we're also equipping our people and our businesses to get the most out of the opportunities that undoubtedly come from this sort of technology. So when I talk about a fused approach, that fused approach isn't just to how we respond to offensive acts or how we might seek to project cyber power. It needs to be a fused approach to how we get the most out of our cyber environment and the relationships that we need. Some of the relationships we need for that are going to be new ones too.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Huawei in your remarks and the way in which the United Kingdom has risk managed the issue of Huawei. You've asked Huawei to spend probably $2 billion on improving its coding. It's work that's underway. It is a very big debate amongst the Five Eyes community as well. People have taken different approaches for the moment. What can you tell us about how that Five Eyes discussion is going on 5G?
Well, let me just reiterate on Huawei. We haven't yet taken a decision on Huawei, and in repeating some things we said publicly last week again today, I'm really hoping that the sort of objective, standards-based advice encouraging resilience in design and in helping us all to think about diversity supply, that those comments are beginning to land. But the decisions we take about Huawei are much more than the technical design, which is the thing that I worry about the most. They're political and economic decisions too. And all of us as nations will have a different environment within which those 5G technologies are being rolled out, and all of us will be wanting to take our own decisions about how best to do that, both to maximize the utility of those networks, but crucially to manage the risk where there are risks. So in proposing that framework, we think we've proposed something which is fairly environmentally agnostic, if you like. And we are, and all of us, including in the Five Eyes Alliance, are sharing our analysis of what we think that means, are sharing our understanding of what the threat is, and are sharing our views and our technical experts' view on how best to mitigate against the sorts of resilience and other risks that people have been talking about in this debate. It's a vain hope, but I hope we can bring some real technical expertise and diligence to the conversation, And then that will feed into a broader review, which in the UK will conclude in the springtime period, where ministers can take a view on how they want to manage this going forward.
We at the IISS have sort of looked a little bit about the extent of China's digital Silk Road, and there's about 58 countries along that digital Silk Road. Many of them are in the European Union. You talked about the need to share, thinking about like-minded states. How is your dialogue with partners and friends in the European Union going on this 5G debate, and also on the larger question that you raised about the importance of occasionally engaging in attribution in order to deter malevolent actors from future activity in this area?
Well, I had a sweepstake on how long it would take for Brexit to come up, so actually did pretty well there, John. Look, national security has never been a competence of the European Union. That's the first thing I should say here. So the work that my agency does, the intelligence and security agencies do with our European partners, is stronger now than it was at the time of the referendum, and that's because it's driven by a shared view of the threats and a shared understanding that we need to work together to mitigate those threats. So that's the background to this. We are talking about the 5G issue with our European partners, and we've shared broadly, including before last week's speech, the framework within which we are going to try and make these decisions. And I think there's a pretty common view on the importance of those 3 points. Where that differs is the way in which the technology is currently employed in all of these states, the way in which the networks are configured, the private sector interests in each of those countries, and the way in which 5G is proposed to be rolled out for all of them. And there's no way that any one of us can dictate a single approach to that. So we're committed to, irrespective of March 29th, we will keep working very closely with our European friends and allies and keep sharing that analysis. And then each of those countries will have to take their own decision based on the circumstances in their country. And
on the question of attribution, how widely shared is that as a policy instrument amongst your friends and partners internationally?
Well, I think you know it's not shared as widely as we'd like, but I do see more countries getting involved and interested in it. And certainly the last few attributions that the UK has done with its allies, we've seen more countries involved in those attributions. So we think this works. We think it imposes a cost. We think that it imposes more of a cost when more allies are involved with it. So we will continue working through policy channels to try and make sure that every nation has the ability to understand why we've taken these decisions and has the choice to get involved with attribution if they want to. I recognise that the environment again is different for each of those countries. They will have to take their own view on that. But I think attribution is with us. We're not going to back away from attribution, and I think as a technique for calling out behaviours when it crosses our red lines, then it's an important bit of our toolkit.
Jeremy Fleming, thank you very much. I mean, understanding cyber power has become a little bit of a cottage industry, but it's pretty early stage for helping everybody in this audience understand a little bit more the elements of cyber power and how the United Kingdom addresses it within a legal framework and with an understanding of the need to develop more appreciation of the requirement for some norms and standards where we can develop and embed them. We thank you very much. This, I think, was your first speech in Southeast Asia, your first in the Indo-Pacific. I hope it won't be your last, as I think everyone in this audience agrees. So thank you very much for delivering the 35th Fullerton Lecture.
Thanks, John.